Hi, this is episode 43 of Crondos. I'm your host, Jordan Hudgens. I'm a Ruby dev and the CTO of the DevCamp platform. On Wednesdays, I like to cover topics related to improving as a developer, and today I'm going to discuss how you can find the balance of best practices versus creativity as a coder. To be honest, this was initially a really difficult script to write, mainly because I had a hard time organizing my thoughts on the topic since it's a little bit abstract. I had the high-level concept of the strained relationship between best practices versus creativity as a developer, in the sense that many developers, especially ones that are new to coding, will fall into two camps. They'll either attempt to follow standardized conventions in every way, essentially duplicating code from tutorials and languages or framework documentation pages. Or they can fall in the second camp, which is ignoring all common practices and building applications in whatever makes the most sense to them. There are pros and cons with both approaches, and like many other topics that we discuss, a cross between the two is going to result in the best process for you as a developer. Let's look at the pros and cons of following the best practices and ignoring the idea of being creative. First, the application code will be easier for future developers to pick up and add features to, since they'll know how the code is structured and where all the methods and classes are located, things like that. Next, programs should be well tested via unit and integration tests, which makes it easier for new developers and for anyone else that's looking at the code. Some of the negatives that come from this type of strategy is that the code structure may have more of a cookie cutter approach. Some implementations tend to have code that suffers from the square peg, round hole syndrome, where the feature really doesn't match the type of design that was implemented because the developer may not have had a template to really base it on. Before I go on, please don't misunderstand me by thinking that what I'm saying is that developers who follow best practices have these issues. I'm simply referring to coders who throw creativity completely out the door and simply try to build programs using standardized methods. Now let's take a look at the pros and cons of developers who only embrace creativity. Some of the pros are they have fun. This is very important since that keeps them motivated to keep building interesting projects and expressing their own perspectives on how applications should be structured. Next, they're constantly trying new things and finding new ways to build features. This can result in them learning quite a bit about the language or framework that they're using. However, there are a lot of negatives associated with this. The first being that the programs that only rely on the developer's creativity can be nearly impossible to manage later on. Even the developer who built the application may have a hard time understanding his own code if he has to go back to it and add new features later on. Next, even though programs built ignoring best practices and relying solely on the developer's creativity are fun in the beginning, as the code base grows, the level of fun decreases exponentially. In fact, it's common for new developers to kill an entire project and have to start from scratch because the code base becomes such a mess following a non-standardized approach. So, if there are pros and cons to both approaches, what is the best way to go? I am a self-taught developer personally, and originally I definitely fell in the second camp of building apps simply using creativity because that's really all I had to go off of. However, I ended up building some horrible applications. I did learn a lot about various languages through the process, and it was a beneficial strategy from an educational standpoint. But over the years, I've matured as a developer and I realized that I had to find a balance between following standardized best practices and being able to add my own creative touches into a program that I'm working on. It's simply ignorant to disregard industry-wide accepted best practices. Concepts such as properly structured, object-oriented code increases a project's maintainability and also makes it more efficient to add new features in the future. Some of the most brilliant minds in the world have spent the past century refining development procedures, and a good developer should build on that cumulative knowledge. With all that being said, there is definitely still a place for being able to integrate your own creativity into a development project. In fact, the more skilled I become as a developer, I realize that I'm much more creative with my code than I ever was before. When I originally started, my creativity was really just an unorganized attempt to get features to work the way I thought they should be structured in my mind. However, around a decade of experience has refined how I build programs, and with that, it has also let me be more expressive with how I write applications. The more confident I become as a developer, the more I've been able to explore different ways of building projects, and I'm having much more fun than ever before. I'll leave you with this thought from Sandy Metz, one of the software developers I personally admire the most, and the author of the book, Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby. When she described the balance between following best practices and implementing creativity and development, she said, "Design is not an assembly line where similarly trained workers construct identical widgets. It's a studio where like-minded artists sculpt custom applications. Design is thus an art, the art of arranging code." I hope that this has been a helpful discussion and will help you find the balance of best practices versus creativity as a developer in your own projects.